Hey folks, welcome back to MCP Week. Thanks again for joining us. Today's video, we're joined by John McBride. John is a staff software engineer here at Zuplo, and of course, as you've already seen this week, the main engineer behind the MCP offering that we now have as part of the Zuplo API Gateway. John, thanks very much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good, Martin.
So I wanted to have you on for a video this week, John, because we've had a bunch of folks already come through to talk about, agents, LLMs, MCP, all of the different aspects of how APIs are working with, artificial intelligence and the technology that's rapidly expanding. And you recently gave a talk called "Agents Are Coming for Your API," and there was a bunch of things there that I thought just really gave some great insight into some of the challenges that are coming up, some of the things that people need to start to think about. And from an engineering point of view, most of all, I think, some new approaches and almost maybe new standard ways of working that folks need to consider these days. So that's what I wanted to talk about. But I guess let's hear it from you. First of all, who you are, what's brought you here to Zuplo, where have you been previously? And we'll jump off from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is John. Obviously, I'm in Denver, Colorado. I've been working in tech for a good little while. I was at Pivotal working on Cloud Foundry, and then we were acquired by VMware. And I was working on Kubernetes stuff there. And then the Broadcom acquisition of VMware. So I have a funny track record of these things, I guess. Then I spent some time at AWS working on Linux-based operating systems, worked at some startups, and then eventually was at the Linux Foundation actually for a little while, where I heard about Zuplo, and just was very excited about the ways that we think about API management, the programmability aspect of a lot of it. Got connected with Nate and Josh, and here we are. The rest is history, as we say.
Let's jump to the talk that you gave. It's called "Agents Are Coming for Your API." Give us a little bit of the outline of what the talk was and where the inspiration for that came from.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the big idea is that, the future of how agents or agentic workflows or humans utilizing AI workflows, really all these things, it's still, in my eyes, going to be a very like Web 2 kind of world, which is very much so based in API openness, or at least like using application programming interfaces as part of platforms to continue to build on top of things, and using those things to build on top of things. I think some people have gotten kind of the idea or the notion that like, oh, agents are just going to be able to go and do stuff. And, we see these commercials where, Matthew McConaughey is getting booked a restaurant or something with some technologies, and it's going to go book your flights and all this stuff. That's still using APIs in that imaginary future. There still has to be these well-defined interfaces that humans, mobile devices, web browsers, and even AI agents can go and utilize, and they're well defined, and the structure makes sense for them to go and use them. And I think a lot of these things, like MCP, the new A to A protocol, a lot of those things are going to start to integrate more and more with APIs as we go along. So there's tons to chew on there, but really the TLDR is it's still all APIs all the time, even if agents are using them.
So I think in that sense, from an engineering point of view, one of the first things that folks probably need to start looking at even right now is like what is AI and agents that are using said LLMs within that AI space doing with your API today, right? Would that be a good starting point?
Yeah, that's a good starting point. I mean, I think where I like to start with some of this is kind of on those first principles on like, just how these things work, and then that can kind of start to drive how they're going to work with APIs. And really, it's not that exciting. It's not that sexy. It's like just a big loop. You have an LLM at the heart of this thing, and there's this big loop that kind of goes round and round and round. It can take some JSON schema with some of those well-defined tools that you maybe have given it. And a lot of these companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, they call it tool calling or function calling. And in this big loop, you just get this big validation where it can slurp up all the errors, it can slurp up all the outputs, and just keep going around until it sort of decides that, thumbs up, I'm done. That's different from maybe what we would have called one-shots back in well, really just a year or two ago when ChatGPT first became a thing, right? Like the stuff is moving so fast, but a one shot would really just be like, here's some input, and it would give you the output. Now you put that in a big loop, and you can kind of validate some of those inputs and outputs, and you get more or less an agent. Now you could start to imagine how this big loop and doing some of that schema validation and tool calling, how that can sort of start to exist in a world where it's going out and calling your APIs. It's going out and actually doing something actionable with your APIs and the interfaces that you've given these things to then go and really do some stuff, you know. And I think, yeah, starting to understand just how an agent works in that big kind of loop of validation is an important first principle in my opinion, and can kind of start to help you understand like where some of the nuances come from, where some of the problems are, but also where a lot of the power is, because these things can just, you know, keep going and going and going and work all night and do a lot of good stuff when maybe the rest of us are asleep, which is nice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said in the talk that there's like agents can kind of, you know, they autonomously decide to use your APIs, right?
Yeah.
Which is, you know, it's like the bots are coming for you.
Yeah.
You know, how, I guess there's an element there of like, you know, that's a kind of scary thought, right, to begin with for some people, you know, but blocking agents like outright is, you know, maybe not necessarily the best approach for people, right? Why should companies like not necessarily focus on blocking this traffic and maybe consider, you know, management of that traffic, right? And what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say it's no different than trying to, you know, block out web scrapers or you know, different like compliance standards that you may have. Like, I don't think everybody started blocking Europe when GDPR became a thing. It was more or less like, okay, we need to start to understand how we can have compliance around these things, shape our interfaces and user data and all this stuff. Maybe it's a bad example, but you get the idea. You know, it's more about embracing than saying like, oh, we're just going to like keep out certain user agents given, you know, certain constraints or different things. Because ultimately, I mean, these things are knocking on your door already. Like they're already utilizing either your front end to go and do stuff, which in my opinion is a pretty bad experience just because, you know, a lot of common user interfaces and user experiences today were not built for AI agents, but there are tools that they can go and do this thing. Go and check out like browser use, for example. An LLM can like exist in that giant loop of validation by just like looking at HTML elements and clicking around with Playwright and stuff. So, you know, they're already starting to utilize your platforms. They're already starting to utilize your APIs in some sort of sense to go and do things and start having action in the world. So instead, it's better to start preparing some governance, preparing some good policy around like how that should work, so that as these things continue to ramp up and up, we can have kind of a good standard around them, and you're not just like kind of freaking out over, you know, things happening around you, right? I think the web scraping thing is an interesting thing to think about as well. It's almost like this war of attrition, and I don't know if modern web scraping is like a practice that people would still say like you should go and do, but I think it's kind of come back in a sense, and we see a lot of these companies wanting to shut down their APIs and make that an overall worse experience for everybody, in my opinion, where it's like, okay, we're just not going to open anything up because we have a problem with all these things, and maybe data being exfiltrated. Definitely, given your business case, you might need to consider that. But I think a better experience for everyone overall, the humans, the programmers, the AI agents trying to go and do stuff, would be to have kind of that good level of governance and all that stuff. Does that kind of make sense? It's maybe a non-answer, but yeah.
No, it does. It does, absolutely. And, you know, I think, you know, it's almost like you're trying to block the tide of what's coming, right? Which is, you know, inevitably going to have some kind of detrimental impact on your business if you go too hardcore on it and just start shutting everything down. And, you know, you could end up getting left behind ultimately because, you know, someone else is going to step in with, you know, an API powered experience that is greater than yours because you've decided you don't want to go down that route, right? And, you know, then it starts to become, you know, how you manage the access to that data, you know, both when you've got the concept of humans and machines that are going to be accessing it, you know, potentially all of the time. And, I agree with you that scraping the web isn't necessarily the best approach. Agents using browsers to like click around on stuff, it's always just going to depend on how well that's built, and the success that's there, and how the journey from one place to another is described, actually on the screen, right? It doesn't have the explicitness that an API can have, and therefore, does run the risk of just being, a big fail or a repeatable fail. And in fact, one of the other videos we had this week with Z from Superface very much touched on this as well. It's like, you've got to have the concept of like business logic to achieve some of this stuff. And even APIs don't necessarily deliver on that all of the time. But in that sense, quite a lot of the time, front-end experiences don't either. And it isn't necessarily going to help that just by putting it into the same space as what humans have to use and expect that it's going to work the same way.
Right. I think again, going back to first principles, like these things are so persistent, just existing in that never-ending potential loop until it decides it's done or it's reached its goal. So if you give it the thing of like, go book me 2 seats at this nice restaurant down the street or whatever, and it goes to company A, and they've decided to go the shutdown route. Like they don't want agents or these things automatically going and using their APIs or whatever. Or maybe it's like even trying to do the browser thing, and it's just hitting error after error after error. It'll eventually decide to go try something else entirely, and that could be company B, who has prepared for this agentic future, who again has the good data and API governance and policy to make that possible and make that a good experience, honestly, for the AI agent. Because sometime people out there go and try like Claude Code or OpenAI's Codex thing and give it like kind of an impossible task, and you'll see it start to just kind of be like, oh, I'm failing and almost getting frustrated. And we don't want to anthropomorphize these things too much, but thinking about a good agentic experience can be a powerful way to start to build for that future, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the talk, you mentioned that, the API responses are your dialogue with with agents, and
exactly.
That's the communication that's happening. It's ultimately the only thing that they know. What kind of mistakes are people making here? Is it very much just that actually this is what good quality API design should look like, or is there something specific here that you need to think about that layers on top of this when you're actually considering agentic access to that API?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that there is just good old-fashioned, like building a good API with rate limiting and good policy and good like object level authorization and making sure that it's not like too leaky of an abstraction with some of these things. Because ultimately, like you load up too much garbage into an LLM with all this context, it really is garbage in, garbage out. So having like really, really good definitions and really, really good, tool summaries and things that you just tell it in your APIs how it works, which kind of also goes back to just good old fashioned, like an API catalog with like Open API, and then using that to, maybe like transform into MCP tools like we've built with Zuplo's MCP gateway. So I would say like first, like just having good old fashioned, like we're doing API and we're doing it right with like good policy and good governance and all that stuff. Then sort of more on the like we're actually embracing AI agentic flows. I think people should continue to think about like how good schemas work inside of their APIs. I think that is like supremely critical, especially in any sort of like agentic loop with tool calling. Because ultimately how this thing kind of works is, how really any agent works, is they get some JSON that looks like how you would call an API schema inside of Open API or something. So just is like, oh, okay, like for a birthday, maybe it's got a date, maybe it's got like, age or something, and we require the date. And that's like the one required thing inside of this schema of how this thing should get called. When that gets fed into an LLM, they're not actually really deserializing the JSON. Like these things have been fine-tuned on reading and understanding JSON and then spitting out JSON again. But, and this is a huge but, they're not actually like programmatically spitting out JSON from the LLM side when it actually does the tool calling or the function calling. I've seen like maybe once or twice where it just kind of puked on some JSON, where it just like missed a comma here or there. And again, like any like sane JSON deserializing library in code would actually never do that. But because the LLM is just spitting back out some JSON for the tool call that it thinks it needs to do, that's where that validation loop becomes all important. And ultimately, we fed it some stuff from your API schema so it can understand that. So all that to say, and to land the plane on that rant, it's really about like having just supremely tight schemas inside of your definitions, which goes back to just having a good catalog and having that good API definitions ultimately.
There is a lot of misconception still around what's underlying this and what actually happens, and this is something that in a couple of the videos this week we've dug into a little bit more. So it's great to get your take on how this is working and really where things can start to fall apart.
Right.
You mentioned the loop that effectively happens here as well, and that actually agents can get stuck in those loops, and that can cause a detrimental impact on APIs as well. How do you prevent something like this from like taking down your API ultimately? What are the considerations that you need to have in mind? I mean, ultimately, previously when you were doing APIs, you would always have this kind of consideration in mind as well. But from an agentic point of view, are they different?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we can all imagine like, and it sort of feels like the web scraper example where like say 1,000 agents are just kind of spinning, and they're just hitting your APIs, trying different things. I mean, again, I think there's a few things that make a ton of sense, like good error handling inside of your APIs. Like, obviously, don't like send back sensitive information that'll then get piped into an LLM. Think about like sort of how some of that stuff should flow in the error handling case. But telling them in that dialogue what the problem is can help them not have to guess or do a lot of guesswork. Like having built some agents in the past, I remember early on, I would just kind of pipe back like, oh, it's like a 400, like, or it's a 404, and then it would just try a bunch of different other things, like different permutations of what maybe some of the instructions it was given. It was like, oh, that's bad. You're just gonna keep getting problem after problem after problem. So yeah, having that clear dialogue, which really is the back and forth, even in error handling and error messages. And that also goes back to the good kind of schema, that tight schema management inside of your catalog, so that if it's using a piece of the schema when it's making a request wrong, it can understand why. Maybe, again, back to the birthday request, maybe it's got to be like dates instead of date. It would error on that, but it would never know why unless you had defined that well or told it in the error handling. I think, like rate limiting, again, I think is another big one. You can get really fancy with this with like various, maybe semantic caching. You could do other things with various policy around like IP handling and like key management, a bunch of this stuff for that. This sort of, again, goes into just like good API management for some of these things, just like any other user. If I was building something with some SDK against an API and I accidentally put it in a for loop, that would pretty quickly hit a rate limit, just like an agent probably would hit a rate limit. There's all different kinds of things you can do with rate limiting. Again, shout out Zuplo with the rate limiting policies we have and stuff. It's funny because these agents, they can be extremely persistent, and that's just the nature of like how sometimes these get built. Especially if you go in with like a custom LangChain agent and you put it inside of even like a deeper outer loop where it like validates that it's done something correctly outside of that agentic loop. So then it would just keep pushing it into the agentic loop if it was hitting errors and errors and errors. I think just thinking through like how you would handle that from a normal user perspective using your APIs, and then expand from there to make that dialogue make sense for agents and be like excruciatingly clear so that they can handle errors correctly.
One of the other aspects that definitely comes up a lot when having conversations about this is that single request endpoints are probably not the best approach for a lot of this stuff. And actually, some kind of orchestration or kind of bulk batch operations that are either specific for like the agentic consumption or just in general for achieving like a multi-step task or something along those lines, might be the better way to go. What are your thoughts on that?
This is something we've already seen inside of like the third-party inference engine providers like OpenAI and Anthropic. Obviously, like they provide cheaper batch processing inference for LLMs, which makes a ton of sense because obviously these things are like the beating heart of agents and how they work. So they want to save costs and also be able to support big bulk operations on their APIs. So I think that's a really excellent way to mirror that when you go and build things for agents on the other end, because it can ultimately, tons of different ways to implement this. Maybe you do like a bulk submit, and then you can have like a check or something that they can like go back to see how things are, and have like a return timestamp when it can be estimated to have that finished. But ultimately, I mean, it can be about not only cost savings, but also kind of, again, being in that communication loop where you're enabling the agent on the downstream, the consumer, to actually utilize these things in a sane manner. So they're not just existing entirely in a loop, because they can wait. That can be part of how they work as well. Like the agent itself could have a tool that's just like, I'm going to sleep for 30 seconds because that's what the thing I just hit told me to do. Like I submitted a thing and it gave me a timestamp that's 30 seconds from now. I can wait. I can sit in this tool and just wait for 30 seconds without having to just spin tokens and keep going and going and going. Another thing I'd say is documentation. I think going into the future with this will continue to also be extremely important. Where we almost call it like use case driven documentation. The way I think about model context protocol isn't too detached from like documentation, because a lot of the tools that an agent will actually read off an MCP server have sort of little descriptions and like I guess annotations on the tools themselves, because that's the only way that these things are going to understand how they work. It could be some get endpoint, like get V1 users, and then a little description that's like, this will do this and this, because ultimately the LLMs at the beating heart of all these agents are doing natural language processing, despite a lot of the fancy like JSON fine tuning and the tool calling and all this stuff. That natural language processing is extremely important. So all that being said, is there's definitely a future where the documentation that you build for your APIs is much more use case driven and enables agents to kind of go and understand how that document or how the shape of a lot of this works. And this gets a bit more into like the futurology of a bunch of this. Maybe there'll be a protocol going into the future, maybe even part of MCP, where it's like, okay, here's like a docs tool that I could just like feed you a bunch of the docs, or even something that you could like have like well-known docs or something, and it like points to a URL for a bunch of your documentation, all that stuff. That stuff you can start thinking about today, for how you can actually build better experiences in natural language for how you use case, or the use case for your APIs inside of documentation. The last thing I'll say on this as well is, self-service for a lot of these agents, I think, will be also important, because again, they're existing in this like continuous validation loop, and maybe they can go and read the docs in this like foreseeable future. They have some stuff maybe on an MCP server they can go and do, but they're not going to like send an email or like try to set up a meeting with like sales staff, or try to go and, I don't know, contact their friend to get an API key or something, or however else Silicon Valley works behind the scenes these days. It's got to be like self-driven, because these things are going to exist in their validation loop. They're going to go and take action. They're going to autonomously go and decide to take that action. If they want to use your platform, there has to be a way they can take action to go and do that without this kind of like outside world third party thing happening, right? That gets also a bit into like the futurology of it, where these agents are maybe doing more and more autonomously, even like self-driving, signing up for platforms and starting to use your APIs and things. But important to start thinking about, I think.
In the video that that I did earlier in the week with Kevin Swiber, we discussed the concept of exactly that, right? That
Oh, really?
especially in the developer tool space,
Yeah.
really, are we that far away from asking an LLM for a bunch of recommendations around a particular service to use? It'll tell you, and then the next question is, do you want to sign up for option 2? And it'll then take you through that process using tools to actually create your account. And off of the back of that, of course, then you can generate your API key and, actually from there get the beginnings of the hello world documentation, or the code sample directly, inside of your IDE. And in theory, if all of that was just taking place inside of an IDE like Cursor, with the chat window there on the right hand side, and it was just populating that, you've not gone anywhere. And from an onboarding point of view, that feels like probably something that we're going to start to see quite soon, I would say. And I'm very excited about that. Just because I think that the onboarding challenge is always one that needs to be met by many companies, and now we've got the AI onboarding to consider as well.
Yeah. I definitely have a lot of empathy for platforms that are trying to build. It was like, okay, we got to build an API. Oh, now it's like we got the browser. Oh, now we got mobile. Oh, now we got some people went all the way into like Web3 and stuff, and like we have a way your wallet can connect or something. Now it's like there's agents as well, which I think for me is why I sort of have congealed around APIs being the thing that works for browsers, works for mobile. I won't comment on Web3, I guess, but it will. APIs being the thing that works for agents, and being kind of again that beating heart of how they interact with your platform, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a question that I think a lot of people are probably asking themselves right now. They have a business that is predominantly based around APIs. They've had a REST API for a really long time. If they don't build an MCP server for said API and start exposing tools, are they going to miss out?
Man, that's a good question. I don't think anybody is going to miss out, but I think you're not going to be enabling anyone. You're not going to be enabling your downstream consumers, especially agents, to utilize those capabilities in your platform. I'd say especially for developer tools who are primarily around servicing developers, I guess. I would say maybe, you would miss out. A good example I would actually give is GitHub. And obviously GitHub is like on the forefront of so much of this with their Microsoft partnership and building Copilot and a lot of this. They were very early to build an MCP server for GitHub, but ultimately, like if you go and look at the code of this thing, it has a bunch of tools, but it just basically proxies to the GitHub API. And I think that's an excellent example of how they're servicing their developers who, again, are like probably using Cursor or Copilot or any of these things that implement an MCP client. Then I can just be in Cursor and say like, okay, look at the issue in this repo, and it can go and use GitHub's APIs using that MCP server to actually pull in that context. Or like, go and open the pull request based on these code changes you made. It can actually do that, pushing the code up and then actually opening the pull request on GitHub. And yet, looking at that, you can sort of start to see and understand like the new types of developer flows that are really, I think, are kind of becoming the de facto way that people are building software today. It's at least becoming an extremely popular way. And I think that is sort of the cutting edge. And I think very quickly followed by that are going to be basically the rest of the industry. And then other technology industries, and then other industries that utilize APIs as core parts of their business. So I'd say if you're building for developers today, you should get on MCP pretty quickly. If you're building for technology tomorrow, I think that it would behoove you to not do this today because you'd be on the cutting edge. And then that'll be quickly followed by, I think, the rest of industry that uses APIs.
Let's go out big.
Okay.
3 things this quarter that engineers or companies, people who are watching this, could be doing right now to prepare for the onslaught of agent traffic that is likely coming their way. What should they focus on?
Yeah, I mean, understanding how your APIs are cataloged, I think is probably key, because that's going to be the underpinning and the core principles of how any AI agent is going to interface with your APIs. You need good descriptions, the schemas, a bunch of that stuff. I would say that's probably the most key. Then, yeah, understanding rate limiting and how you implement that, I think will also be really key. And then implementing MCP. Shout out again to the MCP gateway we built. I think that'll be just a super quick and easy way for people to adopt MCP servers and then enable people to start utilizing their APIs, which is exactly why we built it. Like, you already have APIs on Zuplo. Like, there's the MCP server. You can just go and do it, and it starts working, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, John, thank you so much for sharing the takeaways from that talk. I really appreciate your insights into all of this as well. And of course, if you've watched this video and not seen any of the others from this week so far, then feel free to check out the playlist that's on the screen right now. You'll also see the video in there of John and I going through working with the MCP gateway inside of Zuplo as well. So if you've listened to this and you think, actually, this is something I want to check out, that should be the next video that you go and watch, and check out the rest in the playlist as well, with interviews with Z from Superface and Kevin Swiber as well. Thanks so much for watching this. We very much appreciate you being here. Feel free to subscribe for more videos very much like this on a weekly basis, and we will see you very soon.